Good morning, everyone. I am Laurel McHargue, host of Alligator Preserves, and I have with me again today Kathy Taylor. Now, Kathy, 2 years ago, it was 2 years ago. And
It's
by the
been two
way,
years.
by the way, happy winter solstice day, the shortest
Uh,
day of the year.
Same to
Yay!
you. Yes.
Yay!
The
It'll
days will
get
get longer from now on.
yeah, I am so happy. 2 years ago, I interviewed you on your book, Trees and Other Witnesses, a book I absolutely, totally adored. Everybody go out and buy it right now. Who are you today? And after you answer this, of course, I'm going to go back and listen to my interview that I did 2 years ago and see who you were 2 years ago. Tell our audience who you are today.
Who I am today. Wow. Um, I think that's partly what my book's about, but um, I think I am a different person to the extent that I did something I never thought I would do. I never planned to write a novel. Never thought I would. Didn't know how. Um, and I just kind of fell organically into the experience. In fact, it was kind of your fault because you were the one who said, when I told you about this, you said you should write a novel. And I said, well, I never done that. I wouldn't know how. And then I said, I had an idea once 20 some years ago. And I told you about the idea. And you said, that sounds like a great idea. Just do it. And I'm like, no, but the time's passed. And no, just do it. And so I bought this wonderful journal and started writing down notes and thought, just ideas. And I thought, how will I ever pull that together? And I finally one day just sat down, wrote on my journal, February 7th, I am starting writing, and didn't stop from there. It just wrote itself inside me like a birth, like a pregnancy.
So you're a different person than you were a couple of years ago.
you
So
know,
we're talking today about your novel, The Birthing House. Now, let me just say, this is so multi-layered, complex, filled with musings about language, words, dreams, time, history, trees. You mentioned trees in here too,
oh,
which
of
I love.
course,
You do love trees, yes?
I seem to, yes.
Yes, I do too. Who can't love a tree?
Yeah, really.
How would you characterize the genre of this work? Because again, multi-layered.
That is the question. I have been asked that. What's your book about? And I of course had to come up with what do they call the elevator,
The
you
elevator
know,
pitch. The
pitch.
elevator
Yes, the
pitch.
elevator pitch. It took me a while. I think of it as literary fiction, women's fiction, multicultural fiction, historical fiction. Um, I think the line that I came up with is, this is a book of literary fiction about writing, memory, and belonging. It's about a lot of other things. Then, I continue there with, themes of various things underneath. But it is very much about writing. And I tried to keep, so the protagonist is a writer and writes her way out twice out of grief and loss. And she meets many other characters who have come out of grief or violence or loss of themselves, their homeland, immigrants, refugees. But also the protagonist is kind of writing her way back into herself. And I tried to be really authentic to the times. So 1980, it has two alternating timelines, 20 years apart. So 1980 and 2000 are quite different in the world of writing, in the literary world.
Yes.
I was a professor of literature, among other things, and taught many Latin American novels, a great variety, some of which were kind of like classic traditional novels, and some were very experimental. But the 1990s and into the early 2000s was a period of exploration and experimentation with the postmodern novel. And so as a writer, this protagonist is both a professor of language and literature, but also a very emotional, deeply sort of questioning person. And so she writes all different kinds of writing and writes herself from the deeply personal, emotional, in her journal, sort of unconscious, subconscious, into emails and letters and musings and conversations with her husband and her newfound friends. But she's a professor on sabbatical, so she's supposed to be writing an academic book.
Yeah.
And she's not sure what it's going to be, but she's always been interested in how do you write fiction and what is fiction? What makes fiction different than history or nonfiction? And just like all genres in fiction and writing, people think there's a clear category. And part of what my book is about is challenging those boxes, those clear categories, whether it's your own identity, nationality, language, gender identity, race, whether it's, writing is this or that. And as a woman academic, intellectual, who's also a very emotional, kind of spiritual person, it's not an easy road. And so she's just constantly sort of exploring and crossing those boundaries. So during this whole trajectory of the book that has these two parallel timelines, in the first one, after a miscarriage, she gets pregnant again, and it's pregnancy and going towards birth, which is you think it's the final goal. It's actually just the beginning, right?
Right.
But, and then in the second timeline, she's trying to write this book and like many women writers throughout history, the writing of a book is less about setting up structures, and it's within a certain category. If it's academic, it has to be this, it has to be that. And it's not something completely separate from her life or real life, or it's something that grows out of her and happens to her. So anyway, that's what makes a lot of the complex layers. And I've also alternated between thinking it's really a niche genre, that will only appeal to certain kinds of people. And I've been finding that that's actually not quite true. Of the different readers I've had, the responses, some respond to one thing, some to another. I didn't like that so much. That got in my way, but I love this. I got frustrated when you interrupted talk about babies and it was all warm and fuzzy, and then you talk about something philosophical, and other people's, I love the philosophical part. I've never had a baby, so I wasn't quite so into that. And some of the most thoughtful reviews I've gotten were from men, because I think of this as, in many ways, as women's fiction, but
right.
I think it's kind of questioning all of that.
It questions everything, and it's funny that it's funny that you should bring up the idea of the professor and the fact that you have taught other novels, and because it dawned on me this morning, I was thinking about some other questions to ask you, as I want to do, and I thought, you know what, the Birthing House would be a college level course that someone smart enough could teach, because again, there's so much in there. So let me ask you this. It goes back and forth between two different timelines, a miscarriage, and then 20 years later, the death of a father. This has actually happened to you. Why did you not write this as memoir?
That is a good question. And it's funny because I'll just preface this by saying I just recently got a response from someone who said, oh, this book is so deeply personal. And it's somebody who knows my son, and I loved, getting to know your mother more, and her and you. And I was taken aback at first. Would love to have a conversation with her and say, this really is fiction. Like all writing, I took much of it from my own experience. But I would say more than half of the book is completely imagined. And one of the things that literary fiction does, that likes to do, is privileged character over plot driven structure. So instead of it propelling you along through the story, it sends you deep. And the fact that I have so much detail about this protagonist,
Claire.
and it seems to Claire, yes, and it seems to be convincing. People think, oh, they've told me, people who know me, oh yes, I saw you so much in that book, and that's so you. I'm like, actually, no, Claire, I made her intentionally not like me. And so in many ways, of course, her soul is me or like me, but she's very different. She looks different. Her personality is a little more like my husband's, and Stefan, Claire's husband, is, as my husband says, not at all like me. He's too perfect. He's much nicer than I am. And, so it's the weird thing about writing fiction, that you can take true things about yourself and about life, and make it anything that you want. And so some of the characters are based on real people. My son, my daughter, my husband, friends that we made in Germany living there. But some of the most important characters, like Johann, this older German man, is completely made up.
He was
Samira,
wonderful.
Samira was completely made up. The whole second timeline was completely made up. I told dear German friends who are the basis of a couple characters in the book, Jürgen and Christina, that, we got to have another year of friendship together. I just imagined if we had that second year, so there's a reality underneath it that's very strong, but it's completely freed from, like Willie did not, my son did not do all the things that Willie did. And yet they're kind of authentic to that experience. So if I'd done a memoir, it would have been a completely different book. I did not write the book that Claire writes, which is why I just have pieces of her thinking, the things that that come to her mind, fragments that she sort of started with, but you don't ever get to see what the book is.
Right. There are notes for the book.
Yeah, they're just
your
notes,
book.
and they're fragments. And
Mm-hmm.
some people will say, oh, that's too intellectual. That's, I don't want to deal with that, which is fine, because what they're meant to do is just show what's happening in Claire's mind and inner self, and how this book is growing for her.
Gestating. Yeah.
Gestating. That's the good word for it. Gestating in her as she heals from her grief. Her grief filled her so much with this emptiness that fills, kind of like a balloon. She couldn't write at first, except in her journal. And as the grief begins to fade, just as the loss of the miscarriage begins to fade in the face of a new pregnancy, her loss of her father recedes, I would say, if not fades, as this new life grows within her. And there are even a couple of times when she's writing, she says, I felt a quickening, I felt new life. So the notes for book, that's one example. Some people will just say, I see what they're for, but I don't have to dive in and take that. I don't have to process it. Some other people told me, oh, I just loved that. I got lost in that. And then, then you went back to babies.
Yeah. And her journal entries, she's writing, at least at the beginning, well, I think pretty much all the way through, she's writing to Hannah. She's writing to the owner of the birthing house where she is, which I thought that was an interesting decision to make. A lot of times in a journal, you just write what you want to write, and it's like you're writing your own thoughts. You're not specifically maybe writing to a person, but that writing was almost meant to be read.
Yes.
Yeah. So that was beautiful. We get to know Hannah, the owner of the house, who doesn't appear till at the end, and so that's another layer of the story. So you mentioned Claire's husband, Stefan, loosely based on your own husband. And he's doing research. He's doing historical research. And in his research, he uncovers parish a parish register from the
Yes.
early 1800s, I think.
Yeah. 1700s, 18th century.
So, 18th century, yeah. And there was a line in there I thought was fascinating that Clare says. She says, people's attitudes toward death, or maybe it was Stefan that said it, people's attitudes toward death reveal so much about their lives.
Mm-hmm.
What's your attitude toward death?
Wow. Yeah. Well, let me insert something here as I answer your question. My father did die, but he was 90 when he died and was much later in my life. So that loss was a projection of how it might have been for me if he died much younger, at my current age, maybe 70 something, and suddenly it was not, I did not have that experience, but I was so close to my father that his death, even at 90, when it was a blessing, really, was just unimaginable. It was just so hard to process that, even though if someone dies of old age, it is a process, not a sudden. And I think one of the things I loved about creating the character Clare is looking at that complexity of loss and grief and the stages of it. And the poem in there that I called Grief is a poem I wrote after my dad died. I just think it's one of those things like life and, whatever religious or spiritual faith and values you have or don't have, or they're so incomprehensible that the only way to really deal with it is poetry. And I don't mean literally writing poems necessarily, but the way poetry works, where it juxtaposes things that don't necessarily go together, as a way of expressing kind of in fragments the impossibility of naming exactly. Like narrative tries to sort of tell a story, which, whether it's true or not, there's my interest in history fiction. The truth of it is less important than the way it is told that creates a story that can be a truth, that tells us how it is. Whereas poetry tries to reach that place where there is no way to explain or even narrate, really. But I think one of the things that happened to me with the loss of my own father, and happens to Clare, like the dreams she writes about, some of those are real experiences for me, where at first the loss is so extreme that there was a blank. I'm someone who dreams really deeply and intensely, as Clare does. Yeah, you too.
Me too.
And so after my dad died, I was really upset. It doubled the grief that he did not appear in my dreams. How's that possible? I dream about everything. And how come this most important thing? It was several months. And that's when I wrote that poem about grief, where it was this kind of crisis of that was the opposite of a pregnancy. It starts out, it talks about a loss that is like a birth, but then refilling with this pregnancy that it protrudes only inwards. So that sense of becoming filled up with nothing, filled up with grief. And only as time went by, a few months later, he started to appear in my dreams. And the first dream that appears in this book was where Clare and her mother and sister, and in my dream, it was my mother and sister with me, showed up at this community where I grew up in Pennsylvania. And we went into the dining room, and there was my father sitting there at a table, just chatting away with people and just in his element.
Yeah.
And the three of us stood there with our mouths open in shock. You're supposed to be dead, and we were crying, and he was so involved in his conversation. And then he turned and looked over and said, what? I may be dead, but I'm not deceased. And that was my father's first visit after his death. And so for a year, I wrote a journal of dreams about my father. And it was this wonderful story of its own, of him coming back in different ways with his wonderful wry sense of humor. And then, then sometimes he was an old man, sometimes he was my young father. And so that is almost like a novel in itself, how we move from the emptiness of loss to being refilled with. And I don't know if people in the early 18th century had the luxury of even stopping to contemplate death much, because they were just struggling so hard to survive.
Yeah.
But my husband, Peter, who did this actual research, was really taken with this pastor who for almost 50 years wrote in his book, it was his job to document all of this, and how his approach to death changed. Early on, it was all very Christian, how they died. They died, with God, died peacefully, died. And then later he started to, I think maybe his second wife was the daughter of a doctor or something. Anyway, he began to medicalize it. Also, why they died, that it wasn't just God saying, okay, your time's up.
Your time. Yeah.
But I'd like to just respond to one other thing you said about Hannah, about the owner of the house. That was based on a real experience. We did live in this house that had been owned by a midwife. It's not that house. I had to protect. The woman is 86 years old now, and I had to protect her privacy. But there's a real place. And just by accident, we stayed there, as Claire and Stefan do, because the apartment they were going to rent fell through. And so these friends of ours knew this woman who was going off for a few months, and asked the woman, hey, would you like to rent this to some friends of ours? And she was like, oh my God, I hadn't thought about that, but I can't change anything. I have to leave. And so it was this most wonderful experience of getting to know this house and the personality it had.
Yeah.
So I started writing in a little journal in German, because I wanted to just revive my German.
Yeah.
And found myself addressing the owner of the house, whom I'd never met.
Her
real name was Helena, but and so I just wrote to her in German, and never thinking I would meet her or give it to her. But I just, because the house was so much her. So I kept saying, you're this and you're that. And then she decided to come back early so she could meet us. She actually called a couple times. And so she did. And she knocked on the door, I opened the door, and we just hugged each other like old friends. And but we only were there for like 6 weeks or something, or it wasn't very long.
Right.
That gave me the idea.
No, I mean, it's great. So you have many stories within stories within stories. You have stories of other women from different challenging backgrounds.
Yeah.
Also here with Clare in McHargue. Why did you include their stories?
Well, some of them were based on people that I knew. Real friends of ours who had left Poland during an awful time, or who grew up in the Sudetenland, which was part of Germany, and then it wasn't, and then it was, and just really difficult pasts. So they were exiled or chose to leave, but were leaving behind a homeland. In the case of the Polish couple, they were going to the country of one of their enemies. Poland was alternately taken over by Germany, by Soviet Union, by Russia, the Soviet Union. We did know an Israeli couple, Israeli Jews who left Israel to go to Germany, if you can imagine, and because they actually felt more at home in Germany. A lot of ironies there in terms of identity and
Yeah.
who you feel you are and who you become because of political national changes or
Right.
because of wars. And I did completely imagine Samira, the Somali woman in the
Mhm.
story, but in part because there were many Somali immigrants to Germany. When we were there in the early 80s, it was mostly Turks that you saw, because they had a guest worker program, much like the United States did in the 50s and 60s, of inviting immigrants in to do work that needed to be done. And Johann, that's a very funny story about writing, because I was just thinking I need to have some old person who was born in the house to help move that story along. And so I had Claire out walking, or she was already out walking, and I thought
Yeah.
probably be an old woman. And I was with Claire walking in the park, and there was an old man with a dog. I did not plan him. He just walked into the book. And that story just unfolded.
Beautifully.
Thank you. It just unfolded. I didn't plan it. I didn't know who he was going to be. Um, my husband was helpful with, with the historical stuff. You really can't say this. You'd have to say this at that time. Or, and I wanted there to be a Jewish connection that he wasn't ashamed of, but had to hide in order to protect himself. If you had one Jewish grandparent, it made you a Jew during the Nazi time.
Yeah.
And I don't want to give away too much, but anyway, so some things just, like the
And the
pregnancy.
violin, in your vision, when he appeared to you, did he have a violin?
That, not when he first appeared, but he brought it one day, and I did not have that as a plan, although that I am a musician, and music is pretty close to the ultimate spiritual something experience. And so
Music and poetry. Yeah. I mean,
that was accidental too, but
no, it was
I couldn't
beautiful.
deny it. Johann appeared with his personality, and that was that.
Yeah, and he's wonderful. I'm gonna read something here.
Okay.
Isra's story
Yes.
is difficult.
Mhm.
And let me just read this.
Okay.
November 15th. I think we are all migrants in search of a meaningful life as we flee the prisons that confine us. It's about freedom and belonging. We look for webs of connection that bind us to ourselves. We are not just one thing or the simple negation of something else. So the idea of all of us being migrants on this journey, you have traveled far and wide in your own life. Do you still feel like a migrant?
That's interesting. In many ways, I do. Yeah. There are things about where I live now and about living in this country, in this world, that seem foreign to me, that seem sort of inexplicable. And yet they're very much part of who I am. I have fallen in love with other languages and countries that have become so much a part of me. My husband jokes that they're my lovers, my outside, that I don't just come back home and go back to the self that I was. They even if I don't go back to those countries physically, those experiences have changed me. Now, I'm very privileged in that I wasn't fleeing anything. I wasn't forced to do this. I haven't been forced to give up a huge part of my identity. But I willingly embrace other identities. I take in, the minute you go and spend time in another country, as my 7-year-old daughter said when we first spent time in Mexico, and she was this little blonde girl in a Mexican school, all in Spanish, she said, everybody should be a foreigner sometime. And
Wow.
I think everybody should be a foreigner sometime. And, it does. That being a foreigner, at first, when it's a shock, when everything seems foreign to you, but you are actually the foreigner, is profound. But what's even more profound is when you become so a part of that culture, and language is a big part of that, and you find that the culture becomes not foreign to you, it becomes part of who you are and familiar, then there's a strangeness to that. Well, then who am I? You know, when I spent time in Curacao, for instance, where there are many, it's a very, very complex, multiracial, multicultural place, but there's a lot of people are Black or dark, and every once in a while, I would look at my own skin and go, or look in the mirror and go, whoa, I'm white.
This idea segues, and I think you're probably answering the next question that I have, because Claire is fascinated by how she was a different person in each language, a different person in each language.
Mhm.
So I was going to ask you to elaborate, but it sounds like you already are. So,
well, I can give you an example. For some reason in English, I speak very low in my range. When I sing, I'm higher. And so I've developed kind of even a hoarseness in that low voice. Pero cuando hablo español, hablo más alto. When I speak Spanish, my voice is higher. You know, I was a professor, a teacher of Spanish, so I had to project not only volume, but energy and, you know, the culture of much of the Spanish speaking world. There's a culture that is related to the language that has a kind of passion and intensity, a kind of purity of sound. The vowels are more open and pure. In English, we tend to have things go in the back of our throat. And so, yeah, it kind of changed my personality. And also just the way Spanish is formed. I mean, the way it has some difficult grammatical issues, but much of it is very fluid. And German is building blocks. I have questions at the end of the novel for book clubs, you know, the kind of discussion questions. And one of them is, what is the symbolic significance of Willie's Legos? And there's a lot, you know.
Are you going to answer that question right now?
I don't want to say too much, but as he learns to speak word by word, and he's playing with Legos with a friend, they don't speak each other's language, but the sort of building block structure of German, where words are descriptive, and so they put together these chunks of things to make meaning. It makes it seem clumsy and intimidating to people when they're not used to it. But when you're used to it, as happens with Claire, you know, she doesn't know what Kopfrechnen means. She has to think Kopf is head, and Rechnen is to account, to count. And so Kopfrechnen is doing arithmetic problems in your head. So there's a kind of philosophical aspect to German. And people who don't know it very well also think of it as harsh, and, you know, there's all these stereotypes from movies of World War II, and it's not at all. It has a warmth and a tenderness to it, and a creativity. And so I have Claire say, you know, I think I'm finding my German personality now. I'm feeling sort of maternal and tender instead of passionate and free. And so
it's that part is fascinating too. And again, you know, you've got a lot of Spanish and German words in here, and of course you always translate after. And at first, as a reader, I tend to stumble a little bit, and I might skip over. But then I got curious, because some of the words that were repeated, I started to feel familiar with them, and I felt like I started to learn German, which was kind of cool. And I have a German friend, and I have a son who's learning German, and he absolutely loves it. So that was a surprise that I certainly didn't expect from myself reading it.
That's wonderful.
Yeah,
and some people resent, actually most people resent being sort of feeling forced to learn something. And
Of course,
didn't,
you can always skip over it if you don't.
that's my feeling. I did not
Yeah.
start to say, I'm going to make you learn this or at all. It's a seasoning. It's a reminder that this is happening in German. And early on, the reader sees things that they don't understand. Well, Claire doesn't, and Willie certainly doesn't understand it either. It's sort of the reality of being in another culture.
The readers are learning along with the
I want the
characters who are
readers to
learning.
experience that. Stuff coming at you that you don't understand.
Yeah.
And yet the novel helps you. But I didn't want to just translate everything. And I wanted to create that experience, which you can completely skip over and just go, oh, that's German, whatever. Or you can get caught and look at it and go, huh. But
I think I know what that means.
Yeah. There are a lot of things in this novel that I think, there's a variety, sort of a menu of things that you can, I'd like this, this, and this, and this for dessert, but no, not that. No, not so much of that. But it's there to show you that life is complex. It's not a simple narrative.
Right. No,
things step around in time and place.
Yeah.
You go from tender and romantic to hard and challenging and something with your computer. And I mean, it's just full of that. And we don't take in and process everything. We can't.
Yeah. I'm reminded when you were talking about Spanish and the higher register and music, right? I mean, music, it emotes.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, music makes me want to dance, want to march, want to sing along, want to cry. So yeah, I can see how different languages would change your personality because we're emotional.
They have their own music.
People. Yeah. Wow. Very cool. So the idea of gestation in this story, the book that she's writing within the book that you're writing, there are notes for the book throughout, and this history and this pondering. And I want to read this note for a book. Why do we write? Is it to document, explore, educate, to vent, understand, analyze, entertain? How does our writing begin? What will we call it? Can we really know when we start what it will be when it's finished? Why did you write the book? Why did you have to add the additional challenge of writing a book within a book?
Well, my initial idea for the book years ago, when I found out that the house we were staying in had been a birthing house, and the woman, that when the owner came back and told me that she didn't know that, but she had met a man who came along the street and said, oh, I was born in that house, and she learned about it. I thought, wow, that would make a great novel, this house that has this history. And I thought, at that time, I didn't go very far with it because I was swept back into life and work and kids and all that. But I had thought, well, how would I write about it? Would I do a anthropological, try to interview people and put this whole thing together about the history of this house? Or would I make it fiction? And so then it would have to be about someone learning this. And so I thought it should be a protagonist an American who's coming to Germany for some reason. So why? What is driving her? And I thought, well, maybe she just had a divorce. There are lots of movies about, that, or some big thing in their life, and you go away to some other place to try to find yourself. And it could be a romance, it could be, but I was already back then, and even way before, interested in writing. I gave a Spanish senior seminar a couple times called Writing About Writing, and we read novels that involved writers. And many have become movies that are wonderful too, right? It's the writer's crisis of writing, or trying to find himself or herself by trying to write a book, but can't figure out what to write. And so that metaphor of writing, and trying to is a metaphor of life. Like, who am I? And what do I have to say? And what am I trying to do? And So as Claire says in the very beginning of the book, we're all writers, even those of us who don't claim to be. In fact, could I read that little
Sure. And while you're
thing right
finding
now?
that, you mentioned metaphor, and I recall somewhere in there obviously you love wordplay, and you have
Yeah,
metaphor. What's a metaphor?
yeah, yeah, yeah. There's a lot of play
Yeah,
with.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
okay, this is in the very beginning, but
Okay.
where she's giving a talk to a crowd, and this beginning starts some years after she's written the book. It's kind of it's like a preface, but or a, what do you call it? Prelude, I guess. She says she's going to talk all about her novel, and decides that no, I don't really want to do that. I'm tired of doing that. Because she's been touring around. She says, so thank you for reading my book. You can draw your own conclusions about it. Today, I just want to pose a few questions. Why do we write? How do we write? What do we write about? We are all writers, you know. The words were coming faster than her thoughts. Not just those of us who claim to be, but every one of us. Each moment of our existence. Each moment of our existence is an intersection of stories that inhabit us and connect us. As the present constantly unravels, we weave a future out of the threads of our past, inventing a narrative to make sense of things. We spend our whole lives rewriting that narrative so it can hold the complexity of who we become. So in part, I wanted to just show the process of being a writer. But also, this is a writer who's interested in writing. So not only does she write fiction, but she has written, as I have, written about literature, about how it's written and how we experience it. And some of the intellectual stuff I took from my first book, which was my dissertation and became a book. And it was about, it's called The New Narrative of Mexico, Subversions of History in Latin American or in Mexican fiction. And it was about how way back, early on, I thought I turned the dings off of my,
Don't worry about it.
Early on, most writing about real stuff was done in verse. Epic poetry is, and that was because the bards and the troubadours and had to be able to memorize stuff, and they would travel from village to village, and so they had it in verse and often to music, and often in rhyme. And so that was sort of the real stuff. And then they started writing these chivalric novels and sort of stories, fiction, in narrative form. But then it kind of switched. The early chroniclers wrote in narrative form, and then poetry became, something other than reporting. And, it's a complex history, but we just assume usually that the writing of history is analytic and, and the truth, and based on research and based on foundations of stuff, and fiction is just made up, and it's really not that simple.
No, nothing is that simple.
No, nothing's that simple. And the other thing I wanted to do, I didn't know this in the beginning, but I began to realize it, is to show that many female intellectuals write differently than the traditional intellectuals who were mostly male, and refuse to accept that the brain and the intellectual is this box that's completely separate from the emotional, the physical. Women bear children, and that just isn't something you can put in a separate room. The room's inside. And this happens to Clare. She's determined to read all these German philosophers that, give you a headache, and but also learn something from them. And she's genuinely, and she and her husband have a great relationship of throwing ideas around over their coffee break
and sharing what they
sharing, and exploring. But when, and I don't want to give away the end, but she comes to a different place with the book, and is inspired by this house that she's living in. And so, yeah.
And so
It's
what,
complicated.
what completely different question. What is your favorite genre to read?
I loved reading books like mine, novels that are complicated, and a lot of Latin American novels. There's magical realism involved in a lot of them, and yet a lot of history. They have some of my favorite ones. One of my favorite ones to teach was when I actually had Clare reading in a book at one point by a Puerto Rican author, but ones that have, a sort of a symbolic structure involved, and as you read through, there's just lots to work with, and they're really fun to teach, and students are often overwhelmed at first, and then they really get into it, like a really good mystery. You dig in deep and you find more and more, and it makes you feel like it's changed you. But I've also found, particularly since moving here and writing and being part of the Central Colorado
Writers.
Writers Exchange and others, and I read books by friends of mine, by writers or just writers that I've met, and find myself really opening up to genres that I don't think I particularly go for.
I personally think it's important to read outside your comfort zone. I mean,
absolutely,
this was outside my comfort zone.
You got significant discomfort. Yeah. No, I do. And also to just sort of, it's so instructive as a writer to see what other people are doing and what a particular genre, demands. There's a certain formula. And yet within that, there's infinite creativity. Some people really just, trash romance novels. Oh, they're just all the same. They have the same formula. Well, yes, but how you fill that, somebody like Nora Roberts, who, there's just the inevitable sexual tension and the hot sex scenes and all that stuff, but she researches deeply each context within that structure. And so, I've come to respect and appreciate how that works, or thrillers or mysteries.
I used to be darn it, they can just be fun.
Yeah, right, exactly. I used to be a little annoyed at being manipulated through that formula that I know I'm familiar with, and I'm just like, okay, here we go. Yep, there it is. But when you let go of that and immerse yourself, allow yourself, like it's when you watch a movie, allow yourself to be manipulated. That's what writing's about, and carried along. And and so I read, Cam Torrens novels, for instance, that, they're very much the thriller genre, but he's very playful with it, particularly the second novel. And I found myself just really, really loving it, and finding more to it, and appreciating that structure. And interestingly enough, he was one of the people who most got my novel, which I did not expect. It's not the kind of, it's just not. So you can't predict. Some people choose a genre they like to write, but that doesn't mean that's all they understand at all.
Right. Shout out to Cam Torrens.
Yes.
Author of the novel you're talking about, False Summit.
Yes.
Yeah.
False Summit. Yeah. And
I had fun reading as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the other thing I wanted to say is when I taught creative writing for a long time, it was always in Spanish. And I found that students flourished the most when you gave them a box. If people, writer's block is when you have this blank page of infinite possibility. We're like, what do I do with it? Yeah. But when you say, you have to write a poem using these 3 words, and you've done all that flash fiction kind of stuff. Yeah. Those limitations actually stir up more creativity than an open-ended thing. And so I did all kinds of, prompts and tricks like that with them, and they surprised themselves. Even like having them write a poem in response based on a poem by a famous writer. I would use that as a teaching tool. We'd study the poem deeply, and they would go, well, how can I imitate that without doing it? And it's totally intimidating. How can you write a poem inspired by a great poet and not just sort
Copy
of
or
copy it and
plagiarize
or plagiarize or and so they were always freaked out, and they always did amazing things by just letting go. And so yeah, my whole book is about, challenging boxes, but sometimes boxes are really helpful.
I agree. So I also know that the audiobook for The Birthing House will be coming out. Do you know when?
That's the question I keep asking. It is progressing really well because of the complex cast of characters. And the books, it's not extremely long, but it's substantial. The people I'm working with decided they needed to have 2 narrators. Okay. So there's a woman who does all the narrating, and the female characters, and a man who does all the male characters.
So sometime in 2024.
I just got chapters 10 and 11 the other day, and they're 16. So then it has to be be it's pretty elaborate, pretty complex. So I really don't know. I hope in the next couple of months.
Oh, nice. All right. For a spring break listen, perhaps. So what's next, Kathy? The book about all the dreams your father has visited you in?
My husband says we should write
dreams of my father.
Yeah, right. My husband says I should write a novel not about trying to get it published, but about marketing. And I was like, no, I don't want to go there. No,
that's been done. That's
been done, and it's not fun.
But what is next? What is next?
I don't know. I never know.
Right.
I mean, occasionally I write a poem that happens. I don't usually plan. There are things that sort of percolate, but I just have to wait for it to find me. I think I don't have any specific writing plan at the moment.
All right, maybe we need to have coffee again.
Yes.
So yes. Nudge you towards something else. I don't know.
Yeah, I do appreciate the nudge. And
Kathy, how do readers find you? Where do you want them to go to learn more about you and your work?
Well, one easy way, I have a website that actually is not mine. It's about me. It was created for me, which is a little unsettling in some ways, but it's called Catalina Writes, CATALI, like Catalina Writes, oneword.com. Yep. It's the easiest. But they can also, I guess you can just put my email on.
I will have links and photos, because you will maybe send me some more photos. And I will have links and photos to this, and there'll be an audio version of this as well that I'll put up on my website at leadvillelaurel.com. Even though I live in Salida?
No longer, yes. Salida is your middle name. Leadville, Salida, yeah.
It is, yeah.
Anyway.
Kathy, this has been a pleasure. I have learned a lot, even after reading this book and just talking with you today. And I hope our listeners have learned a few things too, and will not be intimidated by what we have said today about this multi-layered novel.
You don't have to eat everything on your plate.
You don't. Eat every last bean and pea on your plate.
Brussels sprouts, that's what I didn't want to do.
I don't want to pee on my plate.
Oh, that's good.
Kathy, enjoy this last shortest day of the year.
Yes, thank you.
And
Laura, I want to say thank you. As I said in the first interview, you are such an amazing, generous resource. And I enjoy talking to you, even when your questions are tough. Well, especially when your questions are tough, to be honest. It's wonderful. And I'm very grateful for all you do.
Well, I am grateful for what you do too, and our growing friendship, and let's keep going.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Happy holidays. Bye.